The winter wind that tore through Thunder Valley in the dying days of 1877 didn't just carry cold, it carried razors of ice that sliced exposed skin and turned breath into frozen daggers in the lungs. Inside Kessler's trading post, the fire in the stone hearth fought a losing battle against drafts that knifed through every gap in the log walls, making the flames gutter and dance like dying things. Alice Marin stood near the counter, her whole body a study in barely controlled collapse. She was 28, though grief and illness had carved years into her face that hadn't existed 6 months ago. The dress she wore, once a respectable gray wool, now patched at the elbows and torn at the shoulder, hung on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. Her skin held the translucent quality of paper, held to lamplight, bluish around the lips, grayish at the temples. Each breath she took was an act of will against the pneumonia that had colonized her lungs like an occupying army, turning each inhale into broken glass, grinding against tender tissue. The cough came without warning, doubling her over with such violence that she had to grip the counter edge to keep from falling. It rattled up from deep in her chest, a wet tearing sound that brought up bloody foam onto the handkerchief she pressed desperately to her mouth. The spasm lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but felt like drowning slowly on dry land. When it finally released her, she was gasping vision spotted with darkness, tasting copper and salt. In that vulnerable moment, Sergeant Doyle shoved through the door. He was a ruin of a man, wearing a cavalry uniform like a costume from a half-forgotten play. The blue wool coat bore stains that spoke of whiskey tobacco, and worse, crusty patches that might have been vomit or blood or both. His face was flushed, the dangerous red of a serious drinker, broken capillaries mapping his cheeks like creek beds on a surveyor's chart. Behind him, 2 younger troopers hesitated in the doorway, their faces uncertain, already regretting whatever they'd been ordered to do. "There she is," Doyle announced to the room at large, his words slurred but understandable. "The widow Marin, deader and vagrant. Kessler's been carrying her sorry carcass for 2 months, ain't that right?" The proprietor, a squat German immigrant with perpetually worried eyes, wouldn't meet Alice's gaze. He busied himself wiping an already clean section of counter the rag, making small, futile circles. "She owes," he admitted quietly, $17.40, food shelter by the stove firewood. $17. Doyle repeated, savoring the number like it was fine brandy. His hand shot out suddenly, fingers closing around Alice's upper arm with bruising force. She gasped, tried to pull away, but her strength was nothing against his whiskey-fueled grip. The torn fabric at her shoulder ripped further, exposing the pale skin beneath. "That's a considerable debt for a woman with nothing but a needle and thread to her name," Doyle said, pulling her closer. His breath was a toxic cloud of rot gut and decay. "Lucky for you, I'm a generous man. I'll pay your debt every penny in exchange for 1 night of your company. Seems more than fair." The meaning was crystal clear. Alice's stomach lurched, and for a terrible moment she thought she might vomit. She tried to twist free, but the movement triggered another coughing fit, this one worse than before. She felt something tear loose in her chest, felt hot blood fill her mouth. The world tilted sideways, edges going gray. Through the haze of pain and oxygen deprivation, she heard a voice, calm, quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Let her go." The words came from the corner near the stove, where Nayati had been sitting so still that most people forgot he was there. He rose now, unfolding to his full height, with the fluid economy of movement that came from a lifetime of hunting and warfare. He was 32, lean and weathered, with dark hair in 2 braids that hung past his shoulders. His buckskin shirt was worn but clean, and his eyes held the careful watchfulness of a man who knew that the difference between life and death was often measured in seconds. Doyle's head swiveled toward him, lips pulling back in a sneer. This is white business, Savage. Sit your red ass back down before I remember you're not supposed to be in town after dark. Let her go, Nayati repeated, taking a step forward. He didn't reach for the knife at his belt, didn't raise his voice, didn't make any overtly threatening gesture. But something in his posture, the balance, the readiness made the two troopers behind Doyle shift nervously. For a long moment, Doyle seemed to consider escalating. His free hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. Then he laughed a wet, ugly sound and shoved Alice toward Nayati instead. She stumbled, would have fallen if Nayati hadn't caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. Fine, Doyle said, fishing coins from his pocket with exaggerated care. He counted them out slowly, letting them clink one by one onto the counter. $17.40. Paid in full. Which means the debt transfers to whoever paid it. That's frontier law, ain't it, Kessler? The proprietor looked pained, but nodded reluctantly. In Thunder Valley, law was less about statutes and more about who had the power to enforce their interpretation. Doyle had the cavalry behind him, however tenuously. Nayati had nothing. Doyle turned back to Nayati, grinning to show yellowed teeth. So, what's it gonna be, Chief? You paid her debt, which means you own it now. Gonna take her to your blanket, or are you too civilized for that? The two troopers snickered uncertainly. Alice felt Nayati's hand tighten fractionally on her elbow, the only sign of tension in his otherwise calm demeanor. She looked up at him, expecting to see calculation or disgust or the same predatory hunger that radiated from Doyle. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch, not from coughing this time, but from surprise. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held a kind of weary compassion that she hadn't seen in another human face since Jacob died. Moving with deliberate slowness, Nayati reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch. He'd been saving all winter, selling tanned hides to homesteaders, carved bone buttons to the few townspeople who trade with the Lakota medicinal herbs to Dr. Hale. It was meant to buy supplies, come spring ammunition, flour, salt, the necessities that would carry him through until summer. He walked to the counter and emptied the pouch beside Doyle's coins. $17 in various denominations, some silver, some worn paper scrip, that might or might not still be honored by merchants. He counted it out carefully, his face expressionless, and pushed it toward Kessler. Her debt is paid, he said quietly. She leaves free. Doyle's grin widened. He scooped up both piles of coins, making a show of biting one to test its authenticity, then pocketed everything. Well, a red saint. Didn't know your people went in for charity. We don't, Nayati said. But we understand fairness. She's free. You're paid. Business concluded. For a heartbeat, it seemed like Doyle would push further. His hand was still near his pistol, and there was something in his eyes, a mean drunk's need to establish dominance, that suggested he wasn't done. Then from outside came the sound of Dr. Hale's horn, two sharp blasts that echoed across the frozen town. A signal, though, for what Alice couldn't guess. The sound seemed to break whatever violent impulse was building in Doyle. He spat on the floor near Nayati's feet, a last gesture of contempt, and turned toward the door. This ain't finished, he said, pausing at the threshold. I'm not a man who forgets when he's been shown up. You remember that, Savage? The door slammed behind him hard enough to rattle bottles on the shelves. The two troopers followed their relief at leaving palpable. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Alice swayed on her feet, suddenly aware that only Nayati's hand on her elbow was keeping her upright. The room seemed to tilt and spin. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She could hear Kessler moving behind the counter, busy sounds avoiding eye contact, making it clear he wanted no further part of this. Can you walk? Nayati asked quietly. Alice tried to answer, but another coughing fit seized her. This one was brutal, tearing through her chest like claws. She felt her knees buckle, felt Nayati's arm come around her shoulders, supporting her weight. When the spasm finally released her, she was shaking violently, teeth chattering blood, painting her lips. "I'll take that as no," Nayati said. There was no judgment in his voice, just pragmatic assessment. "There's a line cabin near the old well east of town. It has a stove and walls, better than here." "Why?" Alice managed to whisper, her voice raw as broken stone. "Why would you spend your winter savings on me?" Nayati was silent for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he said simply, "Because the cold kills, and I have already paid." Before Alice could process that cryptic answer, before she could argue or thank him or do anything at all, he was guiding her toward the door. She moved like a puppet with half-cut strings, her body responding to his direction more than her own will. Behind them, Kessler had already turned away, rearranging his shelves as if they'd never been there. Outside, the cold hit like a physical blow. Alice gasped, and the frigid air turned her lungs into chambers of ice and fire simultaneously. Her vision went white, then dark, then white again. She would have collapsed if Nayati hadn't been holding her up, his arm steady around her shoulders. "Breathe shallow," he instructed, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. "Small breaths, don't fight it." Alice tried to comply, but her body had its own ideas. Another cough doubled her over, spraying blood onto the pristine snow at their feet. The crimson stood out stark and terrible against the white evidence of how thoroughly her body was failing her. Nayati didn't react with horror or disgust. He simply adjusted his grip, taking more of her weight, and began walking. The line cabin was only a quarter mile, but it might as well have been on the moon. Each step was an ordeal. The wind cut through Alice's inadequate clothing like she was naked. Her fingers and toes had progressed past pain into a dangerous numbness. She was only dimly aware of the landscape, passing snow-covered prairies, scattered juniper, the dark bulk of the well structure emerging from the white. By the time they reached the cabin, Alice's consciousness had narrowed to a pinpoint. She was aware of being guided through a door, of sudden absence of wind, of being lowered onto something, a bench maybe. Then there was warmth, blessed warmth, as Nayati coaxed the banked coals in the barrel stove back to life. She came back to herself gradually, like surfacing from deep water. The cabin was tiny, perhaps 12 feet square, log walls chinked with mud and moss, a single window covered with oiled paper. There was a sleeping platform built against one wall, a rough-hewn table, the stove, and little else. It was crude, but after weeks of sleeping on Kessler's floor by a drafty hearth, it felt like sanctuary. "Drink this," Nayati said, pressing a tin cup into her trembling hands. It was water-cold but clean, and Alice drank in small sips, each one soothing her raw throat fractionally. As feeling returned to her extremities, painful pins and needles that made her gasp, she studied the man who had saved her. He was moving around the small space with efficient economy, feeding the fire, arranging blankets, checking the door latch. Everything about him spoke of competence and self-sufficiency. But there was something else underneath, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "You think you did me a kindness," Alice said when she could speak without immediately coughing. Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough as gravel. "But all you did was postpone the inevitable. I'm dying. This lung fever." She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rattle with each breath. "It's too deep. Without a proper doctor, without real medicine, I'll be dead by spring anyway. You wasted your money." Nayati didn't look up from arranging the fire. "Maybe," he agreed, "but not tonight. Tonight you're alive and warm. That's something." "Is it?" Alice laughed bitterly, immediately regretted it, as the laugh turned into coughing. When she could speak again, her eyes were wet from the coughing or from tears she couldn't say. I had a husband, Jacob Marin. Good man. Too good, maybe. He believed in fairness and justice, in standing up for what was right, even when it was stupid to do so. She paused, staring into the fire, seeing not the flames, but memories. Jacob's earnest face as he showed her his careful ledger entries. His calloused hands, miner's hands, gentle as they tucked a blanket around her shoulders on cold nights. His voice reading aloud from the newspaper, getting angry at injustices thousands of miles away in places they'd never see. He worked at Broken Ridge Mine. She continued, her voice distant. Owned by Ephraim Sloan. You know Sloan. Nayati nodded once. Everyone in the territory knew Sloan, mine owner, land speculator, the kind of man who measured success in dollars and other people's suffering. Jacob figured out Sloan was cheating the workers, Alice said. Short-weighing the gold, doctoring the assay reports, paying in scrip that could only be spent at company stores where everything cost twice what it should. Classic tactics, but Jacob... She stopped, emotion thickening her voice. Jacob kept records. Names, dates, amounts. He thought if he could just gather enough evidence, he could take it to the territorial governor, get Sloan arrested. Her hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, where a folded paper rustled faintly. 6 months ago, there was a cave-in. Jacob died. 3 other miners, too. Sloan ruled it. Accidental paid nothing to the families, claimed the whole site was too unstable to continue operations. Shut it down, moved his operation elsewhere. She met Nayati's eyes directly. But it wasn't an accident. I know it wasn't. Jacob told me the week before that Sloan was getting nervous, that there had been threats. I think Sloan caused that collapse deliberately to shut Jacob up permanently. And you were left with his debts, Nayati said quietly. Everything. The company store debt, the rent on our cabin, even charges for the tools Jacob used in the mine tools Sloan claimed were company property that Jacob had borrowed. By the time Sloan's bookkeepers were done, I owed more than Jacob had earned in 2 years of work. Her voice went flat, emotionless. I've been living on charity ever since. Doing mending for pennies, sleeping where people would let me, watching myself die by inches. The silence that followed was broken only by the fire's pop and hiss. Nayati had finished his preparations and now sat against the wall near the door, his rifle within easy reach, a habit Alice guessed from years of needing to be ready for trouble. Why are you really doing this? Alice asked. And don't tell me it's just about fairness. Nobody gives up their winter savings for a stranger without a reason. Nayati was silent for so long that Alice thought he wouldn't answer. Then, still not looking at her, he began to speak. 6 months ago, I was with my band near a rail spur north of here. The railroad was cutting through our hunting grounds, not the treaty lands, but places we'd used for generations. We knew we couldn't stop them. But some of the younger warriors wanted to try anyway. I was one of them. His hands resting on his knees, clenched slowly into fists. There was a skirmish. Nothing organized, just confusion and dust and anger. I saw a soldier raising his rifle, aiming at my cousin. I threw my lance. I've thrown a lance 1,000 times. I know how to account for wind, for distance. But the dust... He stopped, swallowed. I didn't see the child behind him. A girl, maybe 6 years old. She was hiding behind a supply wagon, and my lance... He stopped again. Alice felt her breath catch. She'd heard variations of this story before, the violence that erupted along the frontier, the terrible accidents that happened in the fog of war. But hearing it from someone who'd lived it, seeing the way his shoulders hunched as if under a physical weight, made it real in a way newspaper accounts never could. She died quickly, Nayati continued, his voice barely audible. I hope it was quick. Her father was a railroad worker. He screamed not words, just sound. The sound of a man whose world had just ended. He finally looked up, meeting Alice's eyes. I left my band that night. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. I've been wandering since, trying to... He gestured vaguely. Balance the scales, I guess. I can't bring her back. Can't undo what I did. But I can choose mercy when violence would be easier. I can help people who need help. It doesn't erase anything, but it's all I have. Understanding settled over Alice like a blanket, not warm but familiar. You're trying to atone? Yes. It was an accident, Alice said carefully. You didn't mean to kill her. Intent doesn't change the outcome. She's still dead. Her father still mourns. No, Alice agreed. But intent changes who you are. You're not a murderer. You're a man who made a terrible mistake in the chaos of war. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I understand guilt. I was angry at Jacob for dying. Angry that he chose principles over survival, that he left me alone to face all of this. That anger feels like guilt sometimes, like if I'd been a better wife, if I'd supported him differently, maybe he'd still be alive. But I know that's not rational. Just like I know that what happened to that child wasn't murder. It was tragedy. There's a difference. Nayati studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone broken, someone waiting to die. Alice felt a bitter smile tug at her lips. Oh, I'm broken, and I am dying, but I'm not done yet. Her hand moved to her pocket again, fingers closing around the paper there. Jacob left me something. Not money. Sloan made sure I'd never see a penny of what Jacob earned. But he left me a map. She pulled out the folded paper, holding it, but not yet opening it. Before he died, Jacob and his partner, Red Whitlow, managed to hide some of the gold they'd excavated. Not stolen gold they'd legitimately dug from ground that should have been their own claim, but that Sloan had claimed through legal manipulation. They planned to come back for it after Winter used it to fund Jacob's campaign against Sloan's corruption. But then the cave-in happened, and Jacob... She stopped, steadying herself. I found this sewn into his coat lining. It shows where the gold is hidden. Or was hidden, for all I know. Whitlow already came back and took it all. May I see it? Nayati asked. Alice hesitated, then unfolded the map and held it out. Nayati studied it carefully, his tracker's eyes cataloging the landmarks. Creek bends a distinctive rock formation, a side canyon marked with a cairn. In one corner, Jacob's careful handwriting, 3 saddlebags, split routes if trouble, J.M. How much gold? Nayati asked. I don't know. Enough to buy my way out of this frozen hell, I hoped. Enough to go somewhere warm where I can breathe without drowning. Alice took the map back, refolding it. I was going to try to reach it alone, but I'm too weak. I'd die before I got halfway. So here's my proposal, help me find this gold, and we split it. Half for me to go south and start over, half for you to do whatever you need to do. Deal. Nayati was quiet, considering. Going after the gold meant moving Alice when she could barely walk. It meant potentially running into Doyle or other trouble. It meant danger on top of danger. But staying here also meant danger. Doyle had made his intentions clear. And at least the gold gave Alice a purpose, something to fight for, besides simple survival. Deal, he said finally. But we do it carefully. You need to get stronger first. At least a few days of rest and medicine, then we go. I don't have a few days, Alice protested. Doyle will come back. And we'll deal with that when it happens. But you're no use to anyone if you collapse halfway to the creek bend and die in the snow. Nayati's voice was firm. We do this smart or we don't do it at all. Alice wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow. The warmth of the stove, the relief of being out of the wind, and the simple fact of having spoken honestly with another human being, all of it combined to drag her towards sleep. All right, she whispered. A few days? But then we go whether I'm ready or not. Agreed. Nayati helped her to the sleeping platform, arranging blankets so she could recline at an angle. Lying flat made the coughing worse. As he worked, Alice studied his face, seeing past the weathered features to something underneath. He carried his guilt like a physical burden, she realized. It was there in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he moved, as if expecting the weight of the world to come crashing down at any moment. Thank you, she said quietly, for not leaving me to Doyle. Nayati didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was soft. Everyone deserves someone who'll fight for them, even when they can't fight for themselves. Those words followed Alice down into sleep, not restful sleep, but the kind where fever dreams mixed with memories. She dreamed of Jacob, his face smiling as they danced at their wedding. Then the smile faded, replaced by the slack expression of death, and she was trying to dig him out of collapsed rock with her bare hands while Sloane stood by laughing. She woke gasping, disoriented, to find Nayati kneeling beside her with a cup of water. Easy, he said. Just a dream. But it wasn't just a dream, Alice thought. It was memory and guilt and fear all twisted together, and no amount of waking would make it go away. The night passed in fragments. Alice would drift into uneasy sleep, wake coughing, drink water, sleep again. Through it all, Nayati remained awake and watchful by the door, a silent guardian against the dangers outside. When dawn finally came gray and reluctant through the oiled paper window, Alice woke to find Nayati gone, and the fire built up to a cheerful crackle. A moment of panic seized her, then the door opened, and he entered carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. Caleb Pike, Nayati explained, seeing her expression. Farmer west of here. He owed me a favor from last autumn. This is bone broth and some potatoes. Not much, but it'll help. The broth was plain, under-seasoned, but Alice drank it gratefully, feeling warmth spread through her chest. As she ate, Nayati explained his plan. He would go to Dr. Hale and trade his remaining herbs for medicine and a house call. It would cost him everything he had left, but Alice needed proper treatment if she was going to survive long enough to search for the gold. I'll be gone perhaps 2 hours, he said. Stay warm. Don't open the door for anyone but me. If Doyle comes, hide and stay silent. Alice nodded, too focused on eating to argue. The food was helping, giving her body fuel to fight the infection ravaging her lungs. She watched Nayati check his knife, pull his coat tight, and slip out into the morning cold. Alone, she pulled out Jacob's map again and studied it by the firelight. She traced the route with one finger north to the creek, following it to the bend, then to the side canyon with the cairn. 8 miles, maybe less. In summer, it would be an easy day's walk. In winter, with her lungs barely functioning, it might as well be 100 miles. But she would do it. She had to. Not just for the gold, but for Jacob. He had died fighting Sloane's corruption. The least she could do was finish what he'd started, recover the gold, use it to expose Sloane, make sure his death meant something. Lost in thought, she almost missed the sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps crunching in snow approaching the cabin. Multiple sets. Alice's heart began to race. She moved as quickly as her body would allow, gathering the blankets and dragging herself toward the corner behind the stove where shadows pooled deepest. She just managed to curl into the space, pulling a blanket over herself when the door crashed open. I know you're in here, widow. Doyle's voice drunk even this early in the morning. Your savage protector ain't around. I watched him leave. Just you and me now. Time to settle our business. Alice pressed deeper into her hiding spot, trying to control her breathing. Each inhale wanted to turn into a cough, but she held it back through sheer force of will, tears streaming down her face from the effort. Come out, come out. Doyle sing-songed, his boots thudding across the floor. I'll find you either way, but it'll go easier if you cooperate. Through a gap in the blanket, Alice could see him moving around the cabin, kicking over Nayati's few possessions, peering under the sleeping platform. He was alone, and the 2 troopers who'd accompanied him yesterday were nowhere in sight. That was something at least. One drunk man she might be able to evade. Multiple men would have been impossible. Doyle moved toward the stove, and Alice's heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. His shadow fell across her hiding spot. He paused, head cocked, listening. Then from outside came the sound of a horn, 2 sharp blasts, the same signal from last night. Dr. Hale. Doyle cursed viciously. He stood still for a moment, clearly torn between continuing his search and avoiding whatever the horn meant. Finally, he spat on the floor, another gesture of contempt, and stomped toward the door. This ain't over, he said to the empty cabin. You hear me? This ain't over. The door slammed. Alice waited, counting her racing heartbeats, until she heard his horse moving away. Only then did she allow herself to collapse, the cough she'd been suppressing exploding out of her in violent spasms. She coughed until there was nothing left, until she was dry heaving and tasting blood, until the world spun, and she passed out from lack of oxygen. She woke to Nayati's hand on her shoulder, his face tight with concern. What happened? Doyle? Alice managed to rasp. Came looking. Dr. Hale's horn scared him off. Nayati's jaw clenched, but he didn't waste time on anger. Instead, he helped Alice back to the sleeping platform and administered the medicine Dr. Hale had provided, a tincture that tasted like turpentine and old leather, but almost immediately eased the tightness in her chest. Dr. Hale says you have pneumonia advanced, Nayati reported. If you stay warm, take the medicine, and rest, you might survive. If you try to travel in this weather... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We have to leave, Alice said urgently. You heard what Doyle said. He'll come back, and next time he'll bring more men. We can't defend this place. I know. Nayati was silent for a moment, thinking. 2 days. We wait 2 days for the medicine to take effect, for you to gather some strength. Then we go after the gold. In the meantime, I'll set up warning signals around the cabin, so we'll know if anyone approaches. It was a compromise, and not a particularly good one, but it was the best they had. Alice nodded, settling back into the blankets. As Nayati moved around the cabin making preparations, she found herself watching him, noting the careful efficiency of his movements, the way he checked and rechecked everything, the burden of responsibility he carried in the set of his shoulders. Nayati, she said quietly, that child, the one you... She hesitated, not wanting to cause pain, but needing to say it. Her death wasn't your fault. War is chaos. Accidents happen. You can't carry that guilt forever. Can I? He didn't look at her. If I let it go, what does that say about the value I place on her life? It says you're human. It says you recognize that holding on to guilt doesn't bring her back, doesn't help her father, doesn't change anything except making you unable to live. Alice paused, gathering her thoughts. Jacob used to say that the real sin isn't making mistakes, it's refusing to learn from them. You made a terrible mistake. But you didn't repeat it. You chose mercy over violence. You saved me when you didn't have to. That child would want you to keep living, to keep choosing kindness. I'm sure of it. Nayati finally looked at her, and for just a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked. She saw the raw grief underneath the crushing weight of a burden he'd been carrying alone for half a year. "How do you know?" he asked, voice rough. "How do you know what she'd want?" "Because no child, no good person would want their death to create more death, more suffering. The best way to honor her memory is to live well, to choose mercy, to help people who need help." Alice held his gaze. "You're already doing that. You just need to let yourself believe it counts for something." The conversation hung between them like a bridge being built in midair, fragile but real. Then the moment passed. Nayati turned back to his preparations, but something had shifted. The weight on his shoulders seemed fractionally lighter. The next 2 days passed in a strange limbo. Nayati spent the daylight hours gathering supplies, trading his carved buttons for dried meat, his remaining herbs for ammunition, anything he could barter for the necessities they'd need for the journey north. Alice rested and took her medicine religiously, feeling the fever slowly recede and strength gradually return to her limbs. At night, they talked. Alice told him about Jacob, not just the idealized memory of a dead husband, but the real man with his stubbornness and his tempers and his absolute refusal to compromise when he believed he was right. Nayati told her about his life before the railway skirmish, about hunting buffalo that were already disappearing, about the slow strangulation of his people's way of life, about watching treaty lands shrink year by year, while more settlers poured in. They were finding something neither had expected, not romance, not yet, but the beginning of trust. The understanding that survival sometimes meant partnership, that two people carrying heavy burdens might manage them better together than apart. On the second night, Alice woke from a nightmare, Jacob's face twisted in death, Sloane's laughter echoing, to find Nayati awake and alert. "I heard you cry out," he said quietly. "Bad dream. Always." Alice sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "It's the same every night. I'm trying to save him, but I can't reach him, and Sloane just watches and laughs." "Guilt," Nayati said. "It wears different masks, but it's the same thing underneath. You feel guilty that you survived, and he didn't." "Maybe." Alice was quiet for a moment. "Or maybe I feel guilty because I'm angry at him. He chose to fight Sloane knowing it was dangerous. He chose principles over me, over our future. And I hate that I'm angry at a dead man, but I am." "That's not wrong," Nayati said. "Anger is grief with nowhere to go. It doesn't mean you loved him less." Alice felt tears prick her eyes, at the first real tears since Jacob's funeral. "How do you let it go? The guilt, the anger?" "I don't know if you do," Nayati admitted. "Maybe you just learn to carry it better. Find reasons to keep going anyway." "Is that what I am to you?" Alice asked. "A reason to keep going?" Nayati considered the question seriously. "At first, yes. You were a way to balance my scales, save one life to make up for the one I took. But now—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now you're more than that. You're someone fighting just as hard as I am, just against different enemies. That makes us allies. Maybe even friends." "Friends," Alice repeated, testing the word. "I haven't had a friend since Jacob died. Everyone else just saw a burden, someone to avoid or exploit. But you—" She trailed off, not quite sure how to finish. "I see someone who refuses to quit," Nayati said. "Even when quitting would be easier. That's worth fighting for." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the wind howled its eternal song, but inside, two people who had been alone found themselves slightly less so. On the morning of the third day, Alice woke feeling different. The tightness in her chest had eased considerably. The cough, while still present, no longer brought up blood with every spasm. The medicine was working not a cure, but enough improvement to make the impossible seem merely extremely difficult. "Today?" Nayati asked, reading her expression. "Today?" Alice confirmed. They prepared carefully. Nayati had managed to borrow. He stubbornly refused to call it stealing a mule from Kessler's corral, leaving a note promising payment. He packed their supplies with meticulous care: blankets, food, water, ammunition, the medicine bottles wrapped in cloth to prevent breaking. Alice dressed in every layer she owned, plus Jacob's old coat that smelled faintly of him and mine dust. They set out just after dawn, heading north into a landscape scrubbed clean by wind and painted white by snow. The going was slow. The mule picked its way carefully through drifts, and they stopped frequently to let Alice rest and take medicine. But they made progress, the landmarks on Jacob's map gradually appearing and falling behind. By midday, they'd reached the old well. Nayati rang the bell, once a clear tone that carried across the empty prairie. "Why ring it?" Alice asked. "Frontier courtesy. Announces we're here, we're not hiding. If someone's tracking us, they already know. Might as well make it official." They pressed on, following the frozen creek north. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of snow under the mule's hooves and Alice's occasional coughing. The cold was relentless, but the sky was clear, a deep, painful blue that seemed to go on forever. They reached the creek bend as the sun began its descent. The cairn was exactly where Jacob had marked it, a neat pile of stones on a rise above the frozen water. Alice felt her heart hammer as they approached. This was it. After everything: Jacob's death, the debts, the illness, Doyle's predation, this might finally be the answer. Nayati dismounted and began carefully removing stones from the cairn. Alice watched from the mule's back, too tense to breathe. Stone after stone came away, revealing the depression beneath. Empty. Not just empty, recently disturbed. The snow in the bottom of the depression had been brushed away, and boot prints marked the frozen mud underneath. "Someone was here," Nayati said, his voice carefully neutral. "Within the last few days." Alice felt something inside her crack. "It's gone, all of it. We came all this way for nothing." "Look at this," Nayati said, crouching beside the depression. "Two different sets of prints. One heavy, one lighter. They didn't come together. See how the lighter prints overlay the heavier ones. Someone found the cache, took it. Then someone else came looking." He followed the prints away from the cairn. "They split here. Heavy prints go southwest toward Thunder Valley. Light prints go east toward the Broken Ridge mine." "The mine." Alice climbed down from the mule, her legs shaky but holding. Why would anyone go to that death trap? Nayati pulled out Jacob's map, studying it with fresh eyes. Jacob's note says 3 saddlebags split routes. This cairn was one location. If someone found this one but didn't have the complete map, they might not know about a second cache. "You think there's more at the mine?" "I think it's worth checking. And I think we need to do it carefully. Whoever left those boot prints might still be there." They continued east, following the faint trail that led to the Broken Ridge mine. The sun was low now, painting the snow in shades of orange and red that looked unsettlingly like blood. They reached the mine as darkness began to fall. The entrance yawned like a mouth, timber supports rotting and sagging. Posted warnings fluttered in the wind. Danger, unstable, no trespassing. Alice stared at the opening, feeling cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Jacob had died in there. Somewhere under tons of collapsed rock, his body still lay. "We don't have to do this," Nayati said quietly. "We can turn back, try another approach." "No." Alice's voice was firm. "If there's evidence in there, if there's any chance of finishing what Jacob started, we have to look." They left the mule tied at a safe distance and approached on foot. Nayati lit a small lantern, shielding the flame carefully. They entered the mine together, the temperature dropping immediately as they moved away from daylight. The tunnel stretched back into darkness, water seeping from the walls and freezing into treacherous ice formations. Their breath steamed in the lamplight, and every sound seemed magnified the drip of water, the creak of ancient timbers, their own footsteps on the uneven ground. 50 feet in, they found recent signs of disturbance, boot prints in the dust-discarded tools, evidence someone had been searching. Nayati held the lantern higher, examining the tunnel structure. "There," Alice said suddenly, pointing to a support timber. Carved into the wood, barely visible under years of grime, was Jacob's mark, a cross with a circle, his miner's signature. Nayati approached the timber, carefully testing its stability. Behind it, partially concealed by shadow, was a narrow gap. He reached in and pulled out an oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a ledger, thick, leather-bound, its pages filled with Jacob's meticulous handwriting. Alice took it with trembling hands, paging through by lamplight. Names, dates, amounts. A complete record of Sloane's systematic theft, documented with the precision of a man who knew his life might depend on the evidence. "This is it," Alice whispered. "This is what Jacob died for. Proof that could take Sloane down." Near the back of the ledger, a final entry caught her eye. "Whitlow took 2 saddlebags after cave-in. Said we'd settle after winter. 3rd bag at freight depot, token Whitlow Freight 12. If I don't make it, someone honest needs to use this evidence. Whitlow has the gold." Alice said, anger and betrayal mixing in her voice. "Or he did. And there's a 3rd bag at the freight depot." Before Nayati could respond, they heard it, voices echoing down the tunnel from deeper in the mine. Male voices arguing. "Told you there'd be something here. Marin was too careful not to leave evidence. Malloy. Sheriff Malloy, Sloane's bought and paid for lawman. If there's gold, someone already took it." That was Doyle, sullen and angry. "Forget the gold. The real value is that ledger. Sloane will pay a fortune to make sure it never sees daylight." They were coming closer. Alice and Nayati exchanged a single glance, no words needed. They turned and ran for the entrance, moving as fast as the treacherous ground allowed. "There's someone's here." The shout echoed off stone walls. A gunshot cracked deafeningly loud in the confined space. The bullet sparked off rock near Nayati's head. He pushed Alice ahead of him, his body shielding hers. Then the mine groaned. It was a deep, fundamental sound, and the protest of stone and timber that had been stressed past endurance. The gunshot had triggered something, or maybe it was just bad timing. Either way, the tunnel was collapsing. Dust began raining from the ceiling. Timbers cracked with sounds like rifle shots. A section of the roof sagged, then gave way with a roar that drowned out everything else. "Move!" Nayati shouted, though Alice could barely hear him over the cacophony. They ran, Alice's lungs screaming, vision narrowing to the point of light that was the entrance. Behind them, the collapse was accelerating, chasing them like a living thing. She could hear Malloy and Doyle shouting, their voices getting cut off as sections of tunnel gave way. 10 feet from the entrance, a timber gave way directly ahead of them. Nayati pulled Alice to the side, pressing them both against the wall, as the wooden beam crashed down where they'd been standing. In that moment, pressed against cold stone, Nayati's body covering hers protectively, the world ending in dust and falling rock, Alice felt something shift inside her. This man, this stranger, who'd paid her debt and saved her life repeatedly, was choosing again and again to put himself between her and death. Not because he owed her anything, not even because of his guilt anymore, but because he decided she was worth saving, worth fighting for, worth the risk. "Now," Nayati shouted. and they broke from the wall, sprinting the final distance. They burst into daylight, just as the tunnel's entrance vomited a massive cloud of dust and debris. The outer sections held, but everything deeper where Malloy and Doyle had been was now blocked by tons of collapsed rock. They collapsed a safe distance away, coughing violently. Alice's chest felt like it was tearing itself apart, but she clutched the ledger to her chest with desperate strength. When she could finally breathe again, she looked back at the mine. "Malloy?" she managed to ask. "I don't know. If he was deep enough." Nayati left the sentence unfinished. Anyone caught in that collapse was either dead or would be before rescue could be organized, if anyone even tried to organize rescue for a corrupt sheriff who'd been in a forbidden mine. "We need to move," Nayati said, pulling himself to his feet. "That collapse will have been heard in town. People will come to investigate. We need to be gone before they do." Alice nodded, letting him help her up. Her legs shook and the coughing fit had brought up blood again, but she was alive. They were both alive, and they had the ledger. They retrieved the mule and turned south, skirting the town proper and heading for the freight depot. The sun was fully set, now stars beginning to emerge in the deep blue vault of sky. The temperature was dropping. It would be a bitter night, but they couldn't afford to stop. The freight depot sat at the southern edge of Thunder Valley, a wooden platform and warehouse, where goods awaited transport to the rail line. As they approached carefully using available cover, they saw someone moving on the platform. A lean man, with a limp, carrying a lantern. In the yellow light, Alice recognized him. "Red Whitlow," she breathed. "Jacob's partner." They watched from concealment as another figure approached from town, well-dressed with the bearing of wealth and authority. Even at distance, the predatory confidence was unmistakable. "Sloan," Nayati murmured. The two men met on the platform. Their conversation was initially too quiet to hear, but the tension was visible in their body language. Then Sloan gestured, and two more men appeared from the warehouse, hired guns, not workers. "He's getting rid of Whitlow," Alice realized, "tying up loose ends." They watched in growing horror as the situation deteriorated. Whitlow tried to back away. One of Sloan's men grabbed his arm. Whitlow jerked free, his hand going to his pistol. The hired gun was faster, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. Whitlow went down hard, clutching his side. Blood spread dark against his shirt. Alice started forward instinctively, but Nayati caught her arm. "You can't help him if you're dead." On the platform, Sloan stood over Whitlow's fallen form. His voice carried now cold and clear. "Stupid. You should have taken the money and left when you had the chance." He crouched beside Whitlow, listening to something. Then he laughed and stood. "A ledger. Jacob Marin kept a ledger, and his widow has it now. How quaint." He looked toward the wilderness. "I suppose I'll have to deal with that too." He walked into the warehouse, leaving Whitlow dying on the platform. Nayati moved immediately, using shadows, and stacked freight as cover. "Stay here," he told Alice. "If shooting starts, run for the mule." "I'm not. Promise me. You're the only one who can get that ledger to someone who matters. Promise." Reluctantly, Alice nodded. Nayati moved like smoke, silent and fast. He reached the platform and crouched beside Whitlow, pressing his hand to the wound. Whitlow's eyes flew open, panicked. "Easy," Nayati said quietly. "Where's the gold?" "Freight 12, back corner, my name on it." Whitlow coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. "Tell Alice, tell her I'm sorry. Cave-in wasn't my fault." Sloan weakened the supports deliberately, meant to scare them, not kill. "Jacob." Another cough. "Jacob figured it out." That's why Sloan had to kill him. The words hit Alice like physical blows. She'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed, knowing that Jacob's death hadn't even been an accident. But murder ignited something in her chest that felt like fire. "Get the gold," Whitlow whispered. "Make it right. Don't let Sloan." His eyes went vacant. He died still gripping Nayati's wrist. Nayati heard voices approaching from the warehouse, Sloan's men returning. No time for mourning. He moved quickly around the building's exterior, finding a side door that was unlocked. Inside the warehouse was a maze of stacked crates and barrels poorly lit, full of shadows. He found Freight 12 in the back corner, a wooden crate marked with Whitlow's name. He pried the lid open with his knife to reveal 3 oilcloth-wrapped bundles. Saddlebags heavy with gold. Voices behind him, Sloan's men searching. Someone was on the platform with Whitlow. Nayati grabbed all 3 bags, slinging them across his shoulders and chest. They were brutally heavy, but he could manage. He moved toward the side door. There, the back. Gunfire erupted. Nayati ran, burst through the door into the night, turned toward where Alice waited. Behind him, men poured out of the warehouse in pursuit. A bullet whined past his ear. Another kicked up snow beside his boot. He ran harder, the gold bags battering against his sides, each impact driving the air from his lungs. Alice had the mule ready. Nayati swung up behind her, and they urged the animal into motion. More shots, one struck a tree beside them with a solid thunk. Then they were moving the mule surprisingly fast, despite its burden carrying them away into darkness. Behind them, Sloan's voice cut through the night. "After them, I want that ledger, and I want them dead." They rode hard, pushing the mule to its limits. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, horses being saddled, men mounting up. They couldn't outrun horses not carrying this much weight. "The creek," Nayati said urgently. "If we can reach it, we can follow it downstream. Ice will hide our tracks." They reached the frozen watercourse and guided the mule onto the ice. It groaned, but held. They moved downstream as fast as they dared, the surface treacherous and uncertain. Behind them, the pursuit sounds grew closer, then mercifully began to fade as Sloan's men lost the trail at the creek bank. They continued for another mile before a Nayati spotted an overhang, where erosion had created a small cave beneath exposed tree roots. They guided the mule into the space and dismounted, arranging branches to conceal the entrance. Minutes later, riders appeared upstream, moving along the creek bank with torches. 4 of them, maybe 5, searching methodically. Alice and Nayati pressed deep into their hiding spot, barely breathing, while the mule stood blessedly still. The riders passed. Their torchlight faded. Silence returned, broken only by the creek's quiet gurgle and Alice's labored breathing. "We need to keep moving," Nayati whispered eventually. "They'll be back." "Where can we go?" Alice asked. "Sloan owns half the territory. Dr. Hale's clinic. She's not afraid of Sloan, and she'll treat your wounds. We get there, regroup, figure out how to get this ledger to someone who can act on it." They waited another 20 minutes to ensure the riders were truly gone, then emerged and continued downstream. They approached Thunder Valley from the east, avoiding main routes. By the time they reached Dr. Hale's clinic, it was near midnight. Nayati knocked, not loud, but firm and steady. A light appeared in the window. The door cracked open, revealing Dr. Hale's stern face. She took one look at them and stepped aside. "Inside, quickly." They stumbled into the warmth of the clinic. Dr. Hale shut and locked the door, drew the curtains, and turned to examine them with a practiced eye. "I heard shooting at the freight depot," she said, already moving toward her medical supplies. "Men dead. Sloan's tearing the town apart looking for someone. I assume that's you." "Yes," Nayati confirmed. We need help. Obviously. Dr. Hale began examining Alice, her hands gentle despite her brisk tone. Pneumonia's worse. You've been exerting yourself, which is precisely what I told you not to do. She checked Alice's wounds, cuts, bruises, but nothing critical. Then she turned to Nayati. And you? I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. But she didn't force the issue. What's the plan? Nayati explained quickly the ledger, the evidence, the need to get it to someone with actual authority. Dr. Hale paged through the ledger, her expression growing darker with each entry. This is damning, she said finally. If this reaches the territorial governor, Sloan hangs. Malloy too, if he survived that mine collapse. She looked up, which means Sloan will kill anyone to prevent that. We know, Alice said. That's why we need help. Dr. Hale sighed heavily. I have a root cellar hidden and naturally cool its temperature steady year-round. You can hide there until Judge Morrison arrives. He's a circuit judge riding this territory. He can convene a special term and impanel a local jury under territorial law. If we can keep you alive until then, we can put this evidence in his hands. They agreed immediately. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the storeroom, a cramped but safe space, perhaps 8 feet square, lined with shelves of medical supplies. Dr. Hale showed them the signal 3 knocks, paused 2 more, and promised to bring food twice daily. As they settled in, Alice finally allowed herself to collapse onto one of the narrow cots. The adrenaline that had sustained her was fading, leaving only exhaustion and pain. We did it, she whispered. We actually got the evidence. And the gold. We got here, Nayati corrected. The judge doesn't arrive for a week. A lot can happen in a week. But for now, they were safe. Hidden underground with the ledger that could bring down Ephraim Sloan with the gold that Jacob and Whitlow had died for, they had finally earned a moment's rest. The week that followed passed in strange compression. Days blurred together in the dim cellar, broken only by Dr. Hale's visits with food and news from outside. Sloan's men had torn apart half the town searching. Caleb Pike's barn had been burned in retaliation for helping them. Doyle had been pulled alive from the mine collapse, broken but living. Malloy had not been so fortunate. His body was found crushed under tons of rock. Through it all, Alice's strength slowly returned. The medicine, the rest, the absence of constant stress, all of it allowed her body to fight back against the pneumonia. The fever broke completely on the 5th day. By the 7th, she could breathe deeply without pain, for the first time in months. At night, lying awake in the darkness, they talked. About Jacob and the child Nayati had killed. About guilt and atonement, and whether either of them would ever feel truly free of their ghosts. About the future uncertain, but possibly shared. When this is over, Alice said one night, when we've given the evidence to the judge and Sloan's arrested. What then? I don't know, Nayati admitted. I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay still. Maybe that's something we could learn together, Alice suggested quietly. Staying still, building something instead of just surviving. Before Nayati could respond, they heard Dr. Hale's signal 3 knocks, paused 2 more. She descended the ladder with unusual urgency. Judge Morrison arrived early, she said. He's at my clinic now, agreed to review evidence privately before making it public. This is it. They climbed into the light, blinking like newborns. In the clinic's main room, Judge Morrison waited, a gray-haired man with eyes that had seen too much compromise, but still held hope for justice. Alice handed him the ledger. 3 years of documented theft, fraud, and corruption by Ephraim Sloan and Sheriff Malloy. The judge read in silence, his expression shifting from interest to anger to grim determination. This is extraordinary. If even half of this is accurate, Sloan should be arrested immediately. Glass shattered. A bottle sailed through the window, a rag stuffed in its mouth and dripping with lamp oil. Once lit, it turned the glass into a hissing comet. Fire bloomed across the wooden floor. "Out the back!" Dr. Hale shouted. They ran as more bottles came through windows, crude firebombs fueled by lamp oil, until the clinic filled with smoke. They burst into the alley to find Sloan waiting with 4 armed men. "Going somewhere?" Sloan was immaculate, despite the violence every inch the successful businessman. "I've been watching the clinic for days waiting for you to surface. Patience is a virtue." Judge Morrison stepped forward. "Ephraim Sloan, you're under arrest for... You're arresting me." Sloan laughed. "With what authority? Malloy's dead. You're one old man in a town where I employ half the population." He gestured to his men. "Kill them, all of them." The hired guns raised their weapons. Nayati stepped in front of Alice instinctively, knowing it was futile, but unable to do anything else. Then a rifle shot cracked. One of Sloan's men dropped, clutching his shoulder. Another shot, a second man fell. The others spun, searching for the source. Caleb Pike appeared on a neighboring roof, rifle in hand. "Told you I'd help if you needed it." More figures appeared. Townspeople, miners, farmers. A dozen at least, all armed. They surrounded the alley, their message clear. Sloan's remaining men looked at each other, calculating impossible odds. Without Malloy's protection, without overwhelming force, they were just criminals facing an angry mob. They ran. Sloan stood alone, his confidence finally cracking. "This isn't over. I own this territory. I own these people. You can't... You own nothing." Alice said, her voice steady and strong. "Jacob spent 3 years documenting your crimes. Whitlow testified before he died. We have evidence, witnesses, and a judge. You've lost." Sloan lunged for her hands, reaching for her throat. Nayati moved faster, his fist catching Sloan's jaw with enough force to spin the man completely around. Sloan hit the ground, hard, gasping. Judge Morrison stepped forward with iron shackles. "Ephraim Sloan, you're under arrest." By sunrise, the circuit judge posted writs at the depot and convened a special term of court in the town hall, impaneling 12 local men as a jury and swearing in a temporary posse to keep order, all in keeping with territorial statute. The trial took 3 days. Judge Morrison presided with grim efficiency, hearing testimony from Alice Nayati, Dr. Hale Caleb, and a dozen miners who'd been cheated. The ledger was entered into evidence, its pages damning beyond any defense Sloan's expensive lawyers could muster. The verdict was guilty on 17 counts. The sentence was 20 years hard labor, effectively life for a man Sloan's age. When it was over, when justice had been served as fully as the frontier allowed, Alice and Nayati stood outside the rebuilt clinic in the weak spring sunshine. "What now?" Nayati asked. Alice took his hand, not tentatively, not briefly, but with intention. "I thought I wanted to leave immediately, run from all this pain and memory. But now..." She looked around Thunder Valley, seeing it differently. Jacob fought for these people. Maybe I owe it to him to stay, at least for a while. Help rebuild, use my share of the gold to repair some of what Sloan destroyed. "That's good," Nayati said. "Staying. What about you? I came here running from guilt. But maybe I don't need to run anymore. Maybe I've paid my debt not to balance some cosmic scale, but because I've learned that survival means moving forward." He paused. "Maybe I could stay too. See how it goes." Alice smiled, the first truly unreserved smile since Jacob's death. For a while, we'll see. That evening, they walked to the old well east of town. Alice reached up and rang the bell once, a clear carrying note. For Jacob, she said. For the miners who died. For Whitlow. For everyone who fought and didn't make it to see this end. She paused. And for us. Because we made it, and that's worth marking. As the bell's note faded, Nayati took Alice's hand. This time she leaned against his shoulder, not just practical contact, but something more. The tentative beginning of trust, of partnership, of whatever they might build together. They stood there until stars emerged brilliant and cold. Tomorrow would bring work, helping rebuild, helping heal, figuring out what shape their lives would take, now that survival was no longer the only goal. But tonight they simply stood together, two people who'd paid their debts, and found that what lay beyond debt was possibility. The wind carried hints of coming spring earth, waking ice, releasing its grip, life, preparing to burst forth. Beneath the turning seasons, people made their small choices and lived with consequences, and occasionally, improbably, found grace. Nayati thought of the child one last time, not with crushing guilt, but with sorrow and acceptance. He couldn't bring her back, couldn't undo that moment. But he could choose mercy going forward, could choose to help rather than harm, could choose to be more than the worst thing he'd ever done. Alice thought of Jacob, his idealism, his stubbornness, his belief that one person could make a difference. She understood now that he'd been right. One person couldn't change the world, but could light a spark that others might tend into flame. At the edge of town, where scattered buildings began, Alice stopped and looked at Nayati in the moonlight. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For choosing mercy when violence would have been easier. For staying when you could have left." "Thank you," he replied, "for giving me a reason to stop running." They stood looking at each other for a long moment. Then, with the tentative care of people who'd been hurt and knew they could be hurt again, and they leaned together and kissed, brief, uncertain, but genuine. When they pulled apart, Alice was smiling. "For a while, we'll see how it goes." "For a while," Nayati agreed. Hand in hand, they walked into Thunder Valley, into the uncertainty of the future, choosing partnership over solitude, hope over despair, life over the many deaths that had threatened them. Above stars wheeled in ancient patterns, indifferent witnesses to one more small story of survival and redemption in the vast American wilderness. The wind blew cold, but spring was coming. The gold they'd fought for sat secure, proof their struggle had been real, that Jacob's sacrifice had meant something. And in a rebuilt cabin on the edge of town, under a roof that no longer leaked, beside a stove that held heat through the night, two people who'd been alone found they didn't have to be anymore. The ledger that had cost so much blood to recover would travel east to the territorial capital, its pages sparking reforms that would ripple through the mining industry for years. Sloan's conviction would embolden other workers to stand up to corruption. The gold would help rebuild lives Sloan had destroyed. But those were future victories, distant and uncertain. For now, there was only this two people standing together under stars, alive, against all odds, choosing each other in the messy, difficult, beautiful work of building something new, from ashes and grief. "Ready?" Alice asked, squeezing Nayati's hand. "Ready," he confirmed. Together they stepped forward into whatever came next, not perfect, not healed, but no longer running, no longer alone. And that, in the end, was enough.